Good morning. I am with two of my favorite people that I get to introduce here for the first time. We have Nadine Strossen with us today, and I am introducing her, who I met you, Nadine, back in 2008. I believe 2007, 2008, when you came to the Air Force Academy and gave a talk there
Yes.
when I was teaching there, but then we didn't connect until many years later when I was working for Parler as Chief Policy Officer. And I found your work where you are defending the right to free speech and inspiration in shaping our community guidelines there. And so now I get to introduce you to Ray Vahey, who is the CEO of BitChute. And BitChute is a video service platform that embodies the same principles that we originally had at Parler: respect for free expression and also for user privacy. BitChute is very adamant about protecting our users' privacy. So Ray, meet Nadine. Nadine, meet Ray.
Ray, wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for defending and promoting the civil liberties of those who are fortunate to use your services. I note that you support and facilitate not only privacy, but also robust free speech, not at all to be taken for granted on platforms these days. So hats off to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And that's a real honor coming from you as someone who's been doing this. I'm an amateur compared to you, what you've done over all of your career. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you and and learn from you. And I hope we can have a good discussion today.
I look forward to it.
Yeah. Now, Nadine told us in advance that because of the number of important Supreme Court opinions being released this week and some today, one in particular that she needs to comment on later, this is going to be a shorter discussion, but I hope it's an entree to a longer discussion. So let me ask you this. So Ray and I are both interested in operating the platform in the spirit of the First Amendment. Obviously, because it is a platform and it's a business, there's going to be some things that you're going to do in order to run it as a profitable business that aren't going to be exactly tracking the First Amendment. But we looked with interest at this Counterman versus Colorado decision this week, in which the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment would require that you have some subjective understanding of the threatening nature of your statements before they would be considered unprotected speech. And in particular, there was a standard of recklessness that the Supreme Court laid out to this. Do you think this is something that is relevant for people like us who are trying to craft community guidelines for our platform? And what do you think of it generally, this ruling?
I think it's very consistent with free speech principles to carefully cabin what has been understood to be a longstanding exception to protected free speech, namely what the Supreme Court has long called a true threat, to underscore that it is a more limited and specific concept than threat, which we tend to use quite loosely in everyday language. For example, I hear many students say they feel threatened if a conservative speaker or another speaker whose ideas they disagree with is on campus. They may describe their emotions that way, but that it has never been sufficient to satisfy the Supreme Court standards. Let me tell you what the standard was before Counterman and how Counterman narrowed it even further. In other words, becoming even more speech protected. But for many decades now, to be an unprotected true threat, number one, and this is really relevant to any platform, the speech must be targeted at a specific individual or a small group of individuals. I think that's a very hard standard to make when you're talking about any kind of mass communication, a one-to-many communication, as opposed to a one-on-one or one-on specifically identified members of a particular group. Beyond that, the Supreme Court said the speaker has to mean was the word they used, mean to instill in the targeted audience members a reasonable fear that they would be subject to immediate violent or violent conduct. And a reasonable fear is a legal term of art, which means it's an objective standard, not a subjective standard. So if somebody's particularly thin-skinned and feels frightened, I'm sorry for them. They should avail themselves of mental health resources, but they may not use that as a justification for suppressing or punishing the speaker. So what the Supreme Court zeroed in on in the Counterman case was the precise meaning, no pun intended, of that word mean, which connoted some degree of intent. And for some people, including some justices, they argued that negligence was enough. If you didn't take sufficient care, that was enough to constitute a true threat, if you also satisfied these other standards. So I think it's very significant that the majority of the Supreme Court said, no, it has to go beyond a failure to take due care. It has to have some degree of intentionality, namely what they call recklessness. I think in everyday speech, we would think of that as some kind of gross negligence. So this is quite typical of the Supreme Court's free speech jurisprudence for many decades now, despite all of the differences among them on constitutional issues where they are usually very closely divided. They have been unanimous or essentially unanimous in strongly protecting speech, including speech that polls show large majorities of the public think should not be protected. So that's very, very encouraging.
I think it is as well. Unfortunately, this standard doesn't apply throughout the world. And in particular, BitChute is located in the UK. We're based in the UK, where we have looming an online safety bill that is going to potentially restrict speech online, more quickly. But and one thing I want to talk with you later about more broadly is sort of a strategy for a platform like us who hopes to continue to protect users' rights to express themselves freely online, but is being confronted with restrictive regulations in various countries throughout the world. And you have a choice to make. You can either choose not to do business in those countries at all, or you would comply within those countries and keep arguing for better standards, arguing for the standards we have in the United States to proliferate around the world. So working within the system and continuing to do business, or deciding, say, you're just going to block an entire country, how you would deal with that. So I'll prepare you, we'll do that discussion another time. But at this point,
I'd really love to hear Ray's perspective and your perspective, Amy, as people who have been in the position of having to confront those governments. And by the way, platforms in this country are having to deal with government pressures, supposedly outside normal channels, right? What was revealed by the Twitter files, all kinds of unofficial, well, not so unofficial pressures and incentives, and one might say, in the loose sense of the term, threats, that if you don't take down certain material, even though it's protected by the First Amendment, you may well be subject to various kinds of punitive regulations. So even in this country, despite the First Amendment, the platforms are put in a very difficult position.
No, it is. And then, we're seeing Twitter go through, preparations for the new European law, the DSA, that's going to go into effect pretty soon as well. So these are all sort of very ominous signs. In particular, if you were ideally running a platform, would you want to hew very close to actual First Amendment in implementing content guidelines? Or would you say, for the purposes of fostering good civil discussion online, that you might go somewhat beyond that and you might construe what a threat is a bit more broadly in implementing guidelines?
So you're asking me as if I will put myself in the position of a consumer. I would love to have a range of options. That to me would be the civil libertarian ideal. That as a consumer of platform services, just as a consumer of books or journalism or any other form of information, ideas, culture, I could choose the range of perspectives, topics that happen to appeal to me. User empowerment, user freedom of choice would be my ideal. And I defer to those who have technological expertise, which certainly do not include myself, I'm sure include both of you, who talk about concepts of interoperability and allowing users to create relationships with third-party intermediaries that would be allowed to interoperate with the platforms to provide a range of filtering options. To take myself, for example, I tend to be very squeamish, so I wouldn't mind being shielded from certain violent images, but I'd like to have that as a choice, in each medium. Schindler's List was certainly filled with grotesque, horrifying violence, but I wouldn't want to be categorically shielded from it. So I would say my touchstone is facilitating as individualized as possible user freedom of choice, up to as a maximum, everything that's protected by the First Amendment. And by the way, also the international law of free speech under United Nations treaties, which is very, very close to First Amendment standards. Many people don't realize that. They look at European law and the law of other countries, which is definitively much less speech protective, but in part because of the large influence that the United States has had historically in the United Nations. Major treaties and interpretations of treaties very much accord with our strong speech protective standards. And that's something else that I think would be really helpful for globally operating platforms to become aware of and to celebrate and implement.
And in your view, this is not only rights protective, but you have argued in your excellent book about hate speech that this is a practical standard, in the sense of, if we're concerned to diminish the amount of hate in the world, so we could talk about racist, sexist, anti-Semitism, all sorts of horrible speech out there. If we actually wanted to reduce this in the world, you have argued that we need to have more speech, not censorship, so that what you're describing as your personal preference is also rights protective and also practical, in the sense of it would reduce the amount of hate in the world, right?
Thank you so much, Amy. And I'm going to bow out of my own personal perspective, because what I really did in my hate speech book was to cite and quote so many human rights activists from countries all over the world and from regional and international human rights organizations who were advocating not more censorship, but less censorship and more counter speech, not at all because of concerns about free speech principles. Under the laws of just about every other country, hate speech is not protected free speech, but purely from the perspective of what is the most effective way to counter hatred. And when you think about it, it makes common sense. We're talking about attitudes. We're talking about actions, certainly any discriminatory or hateful actions, including discriminatory violence, should be outlawed. The laws against it should be strictly enforced. But we're not going to change people's minds by censoring them. And we're certainly not going to change the minds of audience members who history shows and psychology shows become more aware of the censored views and become more sympathetic to the censored speakers. There's the famous forbidden fruits phenomenon. So, the research, my underlying goal as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, as a lifelong crusader for human rights, my underlying goal is to promote human rights and equality and dignity and safety for everybody. And I oppose censorship of hateful speech, of extremist speech, of disinformation, name any controversial category of speech, because no matter how well intended, it does more harm than good to those underlying goals. And we can show that throughout history. We can show it through experience around the world to this day, including on the internet, right? When people get driven off or deplatformed from the mainstream platforms, they go to other platforms where they have less exposure to different perspectives, where they're able to just talk to each other and reinforce each other's views. In the worst case scenario, they go to the so-called dark web, where they become inaccessible to law enforcement. And interestingly enough, many law enforcement and anti-terrorism experts from around the world oppose censorship because they depend on being able to follow and monitor the communications in order to see whether there are plans afoot to engage in actual violent conduct, actual terrorist conduct. So we are, despite perhaps the best intentions, undermining safety as well as equality through censorship.
Yeah, we used to hear in the hearings where Mark Zuckerberg would talk about preventing real world harm. And it seems that the best way to prevent real world harm is to allow for open discussion with the ability of law enforcement to either see these public discussions for themselves, or, occasionally sometimes platforms that become aware of public posts of threatening speech can refer those to law enforcement, where law enforcement can actually do their job. Of course, we didn't see that January 6th. In the weeks leading up to that, there were a couple of platforms that referred violent content to law enforcement, and somehow they didn't get the memo and prevent what happened that day, unfortunately.
Because, we spend disproportionate resources targeting speech, which is the most superficial manifestation of deep-seated attitudes. And we really have to redirect those resources toward education, information, persuasion, to counter the attitudes that we think are harmful, and certainly toward law enforcement. Let me give you one example, which I find very telling. Germany, which has had very strict laws against hate speech, and let me again emphasize, this is particularly poignant to me as the daughter of a German-born Holocaust survivor. During the Weimar Republic, when Hitler rose to power, there were very strict laws against hate speech, which were very strictly enforced, including against leading Nazis. And they welcomed these trials and prosecutions because they became propaganda platforms. The problem was that the Nazis literally got away with murder. They were assaulting and killing Jews and communists and political opponents and other minorities. And moving into the present, Germany, which has maintained the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the world, with the possible exception of a couple Middle Eastern countries. It wasn't until the 21st century that Germany first enacted national laws against discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and so forth, and only did that because they were ordered to do so by the European Union. And even so, Germany missed 1 or 2 deadlines for enacting anti-discrimination laws. And finally, the EU was going to punish it, and Germany did that. So for all of the ongoing problems we have in the United States, quite early on, states started to outlaw actual discriminatory conduct. And I think we have made enormous progress. Obviously, much more needs to be made, but we should salute the progress we made through outlawing conduct and through educational efforts to instill beliefs in and commitments to equality.
Yeah, so your focus would be on the conduct and allow the speech to proliferate so that people can actually change their minds and learn, as opposed to be sort of shoved into different corners to just talk amongst themselves.
Or not to mention shoved into prison, which happens in other countries.
No, certainly. And that's something we're concerned. Now there's virtual prison practically when you're debanked, as we're seeing as a new technique around the world. One question for you, if you looked, because you have traveled now the globe actually fighting for free expression. New Zealand, you talked to me about when I saw you last. You're in Europe often. What is the most significant danger in terms of legislation looming on the horizon for free expression? What do you think? What is most ominous to you as you're observing the trends around the world?
That's such an interesting question, Amy, and I'm going to sidestep it for this reason, which is I think that even more dangerous than legislation are the threats to free speech, using the term threat in the non-First Amendment sense, the dangers to free speech that are coming from private sector powerful institutions and actors, as to which there is no legal remedy, right? So in the United States, we have many laws that are suppressing free speech, including laws that are now at least temporarily enjoined that prohibit the discussion of certain controversial ideas, even on university campuses. But the ACLU, FIRE, and other organizations have been able to bring First Amendment lawsuits to challenge those. In other countries, I have read, I'm sorry, just yesterday, I read a favorable decision from, I can't remember which country it was, but against an overly restrictive hate speech law. So even though other countries' laws aren't quite as speech protective as ours, they still do impose meaningful limits on government censorship. The problem is when you have powerful private sector actors, including major social media platforms, that are not subject to any First Amendment constraints at all. When you have Twitter mobs, when you have cultures that are pervasive in institutions that used to be committed to free speech, from academia to journalism to publishing to libraries to cultural institutions, including theaters, when they are turning against free speech and exercising their power not to publish certain books, not to publish certain op-eds, putting pressure that intimidates people into massive self-censorship, not when we have majorities of people across the ideological spectrum, faculty members and students, not only saying that we dare not raise certain perspectives, but we dare not even talk about certain sensitive topics, not because we're afraid the government is going to put us in jail, but we're afraid of being shamed and shunned and ostracized by our peers. That to me, and that, by the way, is part of the reason why I have been invited to speak all over the world, and not just in, modern developed countries, but in South America and Asian countries. And it's a universal problem and concern.
So you're,
I'd agree with that.
yeah, go ahead, Ray. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. The most pressure we've seen is from private groups, and at BitChute, we've had to create our own infrastructure. We've had to really create everything from the ground up rather than relying on large companies, because otherwise they would have deplatformed us, and in some cases have, to the point where we're even facing deplatforming from banks. But my question would really be, like, over the last 6 years, we've noticed a progression that it's been getting worse and worse from these private groups. What is the motivation that they have? Why are they doing this?
Excellent question, Ray. And before I answer the question, let me echo your point about the need to create new institutions. So you're doing it, and Parler did it through new social media platforms. In the academic sphere, I've been very involved with the University of Austin, which has given me an opportunity to get to visit with Amy in Austin. And there are a couple other new universities that are trying to create structures and systems from the ground up that will ensure robust intellectual freedom and civil discourse. And obviously, we've seen a proliferation of Substack and other independent journalists who have fled from established media. So I continue to harbor hope that these alternative institutions will not only flourish on their own, but will also provide incentives to the legacy institutions to live up to what their professed free speech and civil discourse ideals are. As for your question about what has caused these deteriorating problems, well, let me start with describing the problem, because I think that more precisely, I think that can help to trace what the cause might have been. To the best of my knowledge, and I do try to keep abreast of the interdisciplinary writing about these topics. I mean, this is a cultural issue, so it's not a legal issue. And so I'm very interested in what anthropologists and social psychologists and, other observers of our and historians are saying. And the surveys seem to show that there is very much of an age factor here, that in all of these sectors and in the public as a whole and around the world, to the best of my knowledge, it is the youngest cohorts that are the least supportive of free speech, the least supportive of intellectual heterogeneity and civil discourse. And so what has caused that, to me, that's still the best summary of various theories comes from Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist, and Greg Lukianoff, a lawyer, in The Coddling of the American Mind, which came out in 2018. But they've updated it quite extensively on the website of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And recently, John started his own Substack, which continues to report on social scientific data. And the factors are not only that a certain cohort, I think that the key point was starting sometime in the 1990s. These kids were born, that they had parents that, at least in the developed world, including the United States and the UK, were helicopter parenting and shielding the students, the young people, in an understandable effort to make life comfortable and safe for them. But as Jonathan and other social psychological experts say, no matter how well intended, you're actually undermining their emotional and mental well-being. And that's why we have record numbers of depressed and anxious and suicidal college students and high school students. John Haidt also puts a lot of emphasis on the proliferation of particular social media and the iPhone that it creates so much stress, especially on adolescent girls, fear of missing out and trying to live up to impossible ideals that other people are projecting through their constant selfies, and also reducing the amount of real world interaction. Again, the data is really amazing that younger people are having less, and they're dating less, they're spending less time with friends. They just not are developing the skills and that we sort of unconsciously in my lifetime developed by even Zoom, I guess, is an improvement over just passively sitting in your own bedroom and looking at somebody's selfies. So these are the underlying causes, and obviously it's going to take a lot to address them. John Haidt, for example, has proposed certain age limits on access to certain social media platforms. He's particularly concerned about adolescent girls. As a civil libertarian, I look at any kind of government regulation with a degree of skepticism. What do you think, Ray?
Let me try to just recapitulate there. So are you saying that because of these factors, the kids lack both self-esteem and a certain amount of experience actually having real substantive discussions with their peers, and so that the two of those together make them feel more threatened when confronted with something that they disagree with? Is that
I think
right?
that's exactly right. And I should add that there's a lot of evidence that starting in high school, middle school, perhaps even younger, kids are being so programmed to be fearful of words, and they're being oversensitized to the potential harm of words through exaggerated anti-bullying programs that obviously I completely oppose. Targeted, directed, intimidating expression that singles out somebody, especially on a discriminatory basis. But the descriptions of bullying have become so overly broad and amorphous to include any idea that you disagree with. So, it used to be that folks thought, well, it's these woke progressives who are dominating the faculties in universities that are inculcating skepticism toward and fear of controversial ideas. But it actually seems, no, the students are arriving on campus with those attitudes. And just as they are being overeducated about the potential dangerous impact of speech, they are definitely being undereducated about free speech principles. Even the campuses that have adopted versions of the famous Chicago free speech principles, students aren't even aware of them. So that's part of the reason why I wrote my new book, which is coming out in the fall, in a hope of providing more information about actual free speech principles, because a lot of the hostility toward free speech is actually attacking a caricatured, distorted version of free speech. But how often people who demonize free speech say, oh, you free speech supporters are crazy absolutists, and you think that no speech should ever be restricted, and you think that speech never does any harm. That is completely untrue. Even our very strong speech protective principles in the United States do empower government to outlaw the speech that is the most harmful and the most dangerous. But it also outlaws the censorship that is the most dangerous. It really makes a great deal of common sense And I've found that the more people understand not only the principles of free speech, but also the history that gave rise to it. You know, when I tell these progressive social justice activists on campus that it was their forebears who were censored under hate speech laws, under disinformation laws, under broad concepts of terrorism and extremism. That's why the abolitionists and the suffragists and the anti-war protesters, et cetera, gay rights activists were silenced. And it really, you see a light bulb going off in their head. They don't know enough history, right? They think that their values are the ones that are going to be enforced through these amorphous sensorial powers.
No, definitely not. Tell us the name of your forthcoming book, and can we pre-order it now?
Yes, you actually can, Amy. It's part of a trade-named series published by Oxford University Press called What Everyone Needs to Know. And mine is Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. It is in question and answer format, very user-friendly, and it is available now for pre-ordering via the Oxford University Press website. And depending on the exact format of this wonderful program that you've kindly arranged, it's possible that folks who order it based on viewing this may be entitled to a 30% discount. I will look into that. And if that's true, I will give you the discount code.
Oh, no, that would be great. We
And
would
it's
love
coming
to
out.
share that.
Thank you. It's coming out in October.
In October. Okay. So we want to be conscious of your time and let you go and do the other important things you need to do right now, but we'll continue this later. So we'll call this part 1, but I want to, Ray, do you have any last follow-up for Nadine before we let her go?
No, that was just fantastic answers there. And I'd really like to ask more questions about all about what we do next, how we fix things. But yeah, I'm looking forward to another chat. And I just want to say, I've got your book here. I just started reading it, so I haven't made my way through yet, but so far it's very good.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to both of you for everything that you're doing. I can't wait to continue the conversation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nadine, and have a happy Independence Day next week,
I was going to say, happy anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Definitely.
May we live up to it.
Every day.